The little girl's nose pressed against the frosty glass of her bedroom window, her breath fogging it as she peered through the parting in the heavy, moth-eaten curtains. Her room was dim, lit only by a single flickering candle on her bedside table, casting dancing shadows on peeling wallpaper. Outside, the snow-covered yard stretched into the blackness, the world swallowed by silence except for the faint rustle of the wind. She was smiling, fingers clutching the curtains tightly, her heart fluttering with anticipation. Sweet Mary always came when they were good, Mother said so, and they'd been so good this year. She didn't notice the icy draft sneaking through the cracks in the warped wooden floorboards, or the faint scratching sound coming from somewhere deep inside the house. All she cared about was the faint shimmer she thought she saw near the edge of the yard, and the way her heartbeat quickened in hope. Sound came first, a lilting, disjointed melody of bells and laughter, carried on the wind like the notes of an old forgotten song. The girl's grin widened as the shimmer at the edge of the yard sharpened into form. Sweet Mary, Mari Lwyd, emerged first, a ghostly figure swaying as if floating just above the snow. A pale skeletal face of a horse gleamed in the moonlight, its hollow sockets glimmering with the faintest suggestion of eyes. Ribbons of red, green, and gold fluttered from Mary's skull, catching the wind like tiny flags, while the white cloth draped over her body billowed and twisted like it had a life of her own. Behind her came the others. First was Drimmer, a stout man carrying a drum that he struck in slow, deliberate beats, each one vibrating deep in the girl's chest. To the girl he seemed a herald, his solemn rhythm announcing Mary's arrival like a royal procession. Next was a thin, wiry figure wearing a patchwork cloak, her face hidden beneath a crooked mask. They sang verses in a shrill, lilting voice, weaving a song that made the girl's heart skip. Surely this was Mary's poet, bard, the one who would judge their worthiness. Behind Bard the singer was Iera, a woman in a tattered coat who carried a basket, its contents hidden beneath a ragged cloth. The girl imagined it was filled with gifts, perhaps sweets or trinkets, a reward for her family's goodness. Each figure seemed to shimmer faintly, as if they were not entirely there, but the girl's excitement drowned out any creeping unease. She pressed her hands together, giddy and breathless, as Mary tilted her head toward her window, the ribbons on her skull swaying as if they were reaching for her. "She's here," the girl whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "She's finally here." Violet scrambled from the window with a stifled squeal, her nightgown catching at the edge of the bed as she leapt onto Ivy's mattress. "She's here!" she whispered fiercely, shaking her younger sister awake. Ivy groaned, her green eyes fluttering open in confusion, but Violet was relentless. "Mary, she's come! Get up!" Ivy's face brightened with understanding, and in a moment the two were a tangle of limbs sliding from the bed and darting toward the landing. Bare feet patted on the worn wooden boards as they crouched at the top of the staircase, giggling quietly. Violet's lavender eyes sparkled in the faint glow of the downstairs firelight, while Ivy's green ones showed with matching anticipation. "Do you think she'll come inside this year?" she whispered, gripping Violet's arm. "I hope so," Violet breathed. We've been good. We have to be good enough." Downstairs, their mother, Hazel, moved about the kitchen with quick, deliberate motions, her brow furrowed despite the soft hum of an old lullaby on her lips. Her hair was coming loose from its braid, and her apron was stained with flour and grease, signs of a long day's work. She glanced towards the front door, her humming halting as the faint melody of Mary's approach reached her ears. Something flickered in her eyes, hesitation, or perhaps worry, as she turned back to the stew pot simmering on the hearth. Her husband, Braun, sat slumped in his chair by the fire, a half-empty glass of cider balanced precariously on the armrest. His head lolled slightly, and his snores were soft but irregular, as if even sleep came with effort these days. Violet noticed none of this. She was focused entirely on the door below, her heart pounding with the thrill of what was to come. "Do you think she'll like us?" Ivy whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course she will," Violet replied, her grip on Ivy's hand tightening. "We've been so good this year. She'll see." A sharp, deliberate knock echoed through the house, cutting through the soft hum of the fire and the creak of the old walls. Violet's breath caught as she and Ivy froze, their eyes wide with anticipation. Sweet Mary had arrived. From their perch at the top of the stairs, Violet and Ivy pressed themselves against the banister, the wooden rails cool against their cheeks. As they peered down into the flickering light of the parlor, the room below was a patchwork of shadows cast by the fire, its glow uneven and weak, making everything seem a little too long, a little too stretched. Their mother stood still in the kitchen doorway, the knock having stopped her mid-step. Her hand, roughened from work, hovered just above her apron pocket, where Violet thought she kept a little string of beads, a charm she touched when she was thinking. Her face was set, her lips tight, but there was a softness in her eyes, though Violet couldn't tell if it was nervousness or determination. "What's she waiting for?" Ivy whispered, clutching Violet's sleeve. "She's being polite," Violet answered matter-of-factly. "It's Mary. You don't want to rush to open the door. She'll want us to seem ready." Their mother finally moved, stepping carefully toward the front door. Her shadow loomed behind her, wavering on the wall like it had a mind of its own, though Violet thought nothing of it. The firelight glinted off the brass doorknob as her hand reached for it, but she paused there, her gaze darting toward her husband in his chair. He hadn't stirred at the sound of the knock, and his face, slack and turned toward the fire, seemed almost empty. Their mother's lips pressed into a thinner line, and she turned back to the door without a word, her shoulders squared as though bracing against some unseen force. From above, the girls could just make out the faint sound of singing outside, voices rising and falling in strange rhythmic cadence. The words were muffled, but there was something ancient about the tune, something older than the snow-dusted hills outside. Violet smiled. "They're singing for us," she whispered, her excitement bubbling up. She imagined Mary's entourage standing in the snow, their lanterns glowing softly, their ribbons fluttering in the wind. Her heart swelled with pride. Mary was here, and her mother, strong, kind, always knowing just what to do, would invite her in. Their mother gripped the doorknob tightly now, her knuckles pale in the dim light. Violet could see the rise and fall of her chest as she drew a deep breath, her face caught between two emotions the girl couldn't quite place. "She's ready," Violet whispered to Ivy, squeezing her sister's hand. "Mother's always ready for sweet Mary." As the door creaked open, the faint winter air curled into the room, carrying with it the sharp smell of frost and something faintly metallic. The singing stopped, leaving the house suspended in silence. Violet leaned forward eagerly, trying to see, her heart beating faster as the white draped figure began to take shape in the doorway. The door opened wide enough for the frigid night to spill into the room, and there she was, Mari Lwyd, standing tall and still, her skeletal face gleaming under the flickering glow of the lanterns held by her companions. The ribbons tied to her skull swayed as if moved by a breeze that wasn't there, and her hollow eyes seemed to glow faintly, as though some ember deep within her still burned. Behind her stood the entourage: Drimmer, the stout man with the drum; Bard, the thin-masked singer; and Iera, the basket-bearing woman whose sharp, sunken eyes were fixed on the mother. Their shadows stretched unnaturally long into the house, twisting against the walls and ceiling in strange, shifting shapes. "Welcome," Hazel said, her voice steady but quiet, a practiced calm masking whatever emotion flickered behind her sharp eyes. "You honor us with your presence this year." She stood firm in the doorway, neither stepping back to let them in, nor blocking their way completely. Violet leaned so far over the banister she nearly tipped over, straining to see more. To Violet, this was a moment of magic, a yearly ceremony of worthiness. She watched with her heart in her throat, her breath catching at the sight of the luminous ribbons and the strange grace of Mary's movements. The group at the threshold remained silent for a moment, their stillness unsettling, though Violet didn't notice. She only thought them regal, dignified, as though they were considering the worth of their family's goodness. Finally, the masked singer stepped forward, bowing their head slightly. "Your door is warm, but your worth must be proven, good lady," they said, their voice high and lilting, like a melody barely restrained by words. "As is tradition." The mother didn't flinch. She straightened her shoulders and folded her hands, her apron brushing her knees as she stood tall. "You've always found us worthy, Mary," she said, her voice soft but edged with something Violet couldn't name. "This year will be no different." Mari Lwyd's head tilted, her ribbons brushing the edge of the doorframe, and Bard took another step forward, raising a gloved hand toward the mother. "Ah, but such things must always be tested," he said with an almost teasing lilt. "What sweetness would there be in blessings unearned?" Violet's heart raced as she watched her mother's face. There was a tightness around her lips, a slight furrow of her brow that seemed so out of place on the mother she knew. But to Violet, it only added to the gravity of the moment. "She'll win," Violet whispered to Ivy, clutching her sister's arm. "She always wins." Her hands felt clammy, but her excitement swelled as her mother nodded to the singer, stepping fully into the doorway to meet them. The silence thickened as the singer took another step forward, drawing in a deep breath, as if readying their opening verse. Violet leaned closer, her pulse quickening. It was beginning, the test of their family's goodness, the balance of words that would decide whether Mari Lwyd would step across the threshold. This was the moment Violet lived for each year, and though her stomach churned with nervous energy, her belief in her mother was unwavering. She didn't notice how the shadows from the entourage seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor, or how Mary's ribbons twitched in the still air like they were alive. She only saw magic. Bard stepped fully into the doorway, their voice rising like the wind before a storm. Their words flowed with a strange rhythm, each syllable sharp as the frost clinging to the air. "Through snow and shadow we make our way, to test the worth of those who pray. In deeds or kindness, what's your proof? What grace or virtue hides your truth? Let words, not silence, light this night, and show your soul burns pure and bright. Violet's breath hitched as the words hung in the air, their tone both haunting and playful, each line a challenge wrapped in icy beauty. She leaned forward so far she had to grip the banister, her wide purple eyes fixed on her mother. Her heart pounded with anticipation, her mind racing to imagine how her mother would answer such a riddle. In her childish certainty, she felt no doubt. This was all part of the tradition, a dance of cleverness and courage. Yet the weight of the poet's words pressed at the edges of her mind, like the whisper of something she couldn't quite hear. Her mother stood still for a long moment, her expression unreadable as she seemed to weigh the words. Then drawing herself up, she spoke, her voice firm and clear, carrying a melody of its own. Through hearth and home our lives are shown, in care for seeds that we have sown. In love we toil, in grace we grow, the truth of hearts in deeds will show. Not shadows speak, but hands that mend, our worth is proven in how we tend. The room seemed to hold its breath as her words settled, a firelight flickering against her steady gaze. Violet felt a surge of pride so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. This was her mother, calm, clever, and unshakable. She turned to Ivy, whispering, "She's winning!" Ivy only nodded, clutching her hand tightly. But even as Violet's chest swelled with certainty, something about the figures at the door seemed to shift. The poet tilted their head, the motion bird-like and unnatural, as though considering her mother's response. "Well said," they murmured, their tone thoughtful, even pleased. Then with an almost imperceptible shrug, they spoke again. "Words like honey, words like steel, your strength of heart is sure to heal. Yet still the night demands its due. What proof of worth be shown anew?" The exchange continued, back and forth, each verse a challenge met with another, neither side gaining the upper hand. Violet's head spun as she tried to follow the clever twists of language, the intricate dance of wit and meaning. Hazel never faltered, her responses steady and sure, though there was a growing sharpness in her voice, the flicker of something Violet didn't recognize. When Bard finally stepped back, lowering their head with a strange, graceful bow, Violet felt a pang of disappointment. "Why aren't they letting her win?" she whispered to Ivy, confused. Ivy only shook her head, her green eyes wide with unease she couldn't quite name. The poet raised their voice one last time, their tone solemn yet almost amused. "A draw, then, fair lady. Tonight no victor stands, yet still we knock. We ask your hand. Will you open wide your door and let us see your hearth once more?" The words rang out, and the house seemed to hold its breath again, waiting. Violet's heart raced, her hands gripping the banister so tightly they ached. She looked down at her mother, whose expression was unreadable, as the shadows at the threshold seemed to stretch just a little further into the room. The mother stepped aside, her hand falling to her side as she nodded to the poet. "You may enter," she said, her voice calm but low, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. The doorway filled with movement as Mari Lwyd and her entourage glided inside. Mary's white-draped form seemed almost too large for the narrow entryway, her skeletal head tilting and swiveling as if examining the room. The ribbons cascading from her skull brushed the walls and ceiling, twisting in the air like living things. The faint metallic scent that had lingered outside now thickened, mingling with the warm smell of the fire and the savory aroma of the stew. Rimmer was the first to cross fully into the room, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. He carried his drum like an extension of himself, his eyes glinting in the firelight as he took a place near the hearth. Bard followed, their thin frame cutting a shadow against the wall that seemed to stretch unnaturally far, as though it belonged to something much larger. Iera moved in last, her footsteps almost silent despite the weight of the wicker container she held. She placed it carefully on the table, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if taking inventory. Violet thought she saw a faint, amused curl of the woman's lips before she turned to the fire. Mary moved last, her long shrouded body swaying as if she stepped fully into the house. The ribbons fluttered unnaturally, though there was no breeze, and her head moved slowly, her hollow eyes sweeping the space. Violet shivered but smiled, her excitement undiminished. To her, the arrival of Sweet Mary and her entourage was nothing short of magical. She saw Drimmer, the drummer, as a herald of celebration, Bard, the poet, as a keeper of wisdom, and Iera, the basket woman, as a bearer of blessings. Each seemed to fit perfectly into the story she had told herself about this night. The entourage settled themselves with an eerie ease, as though they had always belonged in the room. Drimmer sat by the hearth, tapping a slow, deliberate beat that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Bard stood near the kitchen, their masked face turned towards the mother, watching her every move with quiet intensity. Iera busied herself with the contents of her basket, but her movements were deliberate and slow, as though savoring the task. Violet barely noticed the way the fire seemed to dim slightly as they entered, or the strange coldness that clung to the air despite the flames. Didn't see her mother's quick glance toward the sleeping father, or the way her shoulders tensed as she approached the table. All Violet could see was the ribbons, the lanterns, the strange beauty of the visitors. She leaned closer to Ivy, whispering, "They look so grand. Do you think they'll stay long?" Ivy nodded, but her grip on Violet's arm tightened, her green eyes flicking nervously between Mary and the others. Violet didn't notice. She was too focused on the way Mari Lwyd's ribbons seemed to glimmer in the firelight, like tiny strands of stars woven into the fabric of the night. Mary's hollow sockets turned upward, settling on the girls at the top of the stairs. For a moment, the ribbons swaying from her skeletal face seemed to slow, almost as though they too were watching. Then the masked poet spoke, their voice lilting like a melody only half remembered. "Come, now, little ones," they said, gesturing with a graceful sweep of their thin hand. "Join us. 'Tis a night for all to share." Violet's heart soared, and she clutched Ivy's hand as she pulled Ivy down the stairs, their bare feet thudding lightly against the wood. "Do you hear that?" Violet whispered breathlessly to her sister. "They want us to join." Ivy followed silently, her green eyes wide and flicking nervously to the draped figure of Mary, but she didn't protest. The girls reached the bottom and stood uncertainly, waiting for their mother to direct them. Help me serve, girls," their mother said briskly, her voice steady but soft. She was already moving, her hands quick and sure as she ladled steaming stew from the pot into the chipped porcelain bowls. Her expression was calm, but her fingers kept tapping the countertop, her movements slightly sharper than usual. Violet didn't notice. She eagerly grabbed a stack of bowls, her small hands steady with pride, and began setting them on the table. Ivy followed, carrying spoons and hunks of bread from the cutting board, her steps slow and hesitant. The table quickly filled with a simple meal, a hearty stew rich with chunks of potato and carrot, slices of thick, slightly stale bread, and small glasses of cider poured from the nearly empty jug. Violet thought it all looked perfect, magical even, as though their home had become part of some grand feast. She didn't glance at her father, slumped in his chair, a soft snore breaking the quiet, as a bit of cider dribbled from the glass in his limp hand. To her, the glowing ribbons, the faint rhythm of the drum, and the way the entourage moved with an almost fay-like grace were all that mattered. When the girls had finished their tasks, their mother nodded curtly, her eyes darting briefly to Bard, for she spoke. "You may sit now," she said, her voice clipped but kind. Violet took Ivy's hand and led her to the table, the two girls settling on the bench across from Mary and her companions. Bard dipped their heads slightly in acknowledgement, the motion fluid and strange, while Drimmer tapped his instrument lightly, as if marking the moment. The meal began quietly, with the visitors eating slowly, almost ceremonially. Violet noticed the way Mary didn't touch the food, but merely tilted her head as though observing. She was too enraptured to think it odd. Between bites, she glanced around the table, drinking in every detail. The way the ribbons on Mary's skull seemed to shimmer faintly. The deliberate way Iera tore her bread into perfect halves. The way Bard's mask seemed to shift slightly when they turned their head. Finally, it was Iera who spoke, her voice low and smooth, with a hint of sharpness that made Violet shiver, though she couldn't say why. "And what of you, little one?" she said, turning her sharp gaze to Violet and Ivy. "What kindnesses have you given to earn such a feast?" Violet's cheeks flushed and her chest swelled with pride. "We've been good," she said earnestly, her voice small but sure. "We help Mother, and I look after Ivy. We always do what we're told, and we never fight." She leaned forward, her lavender eyes wide. "Is that enough? Do you think Mary likes us?" Iera tilted her head, her lips curling into something between a smile and a smirk. "Ah, the little ones always wonder if they are seen," she murmured. "And yes, child, Mary sees all you do." Violet's heart leapt, her face glowing with joy. She turned to Ivy, whispering excitedly, "She sees us, Ivy. She knows we're good." Ivy managed a faint smile, but her eyes remained on the table, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her nightgown. Their mother's expression didn't soften. Her hands folded tightly in her lap as she watched the interaction with an unreadable gaze. The rest of the meal passed with murmured conversation among the entourage, their words strange and lilting, filled with phrases Violet didn't fully understand, but found beautiful all the same. She leaned forward on the bench, soaking in every syllable, her heart fluttering with the thrill of being included in such a wondrous night. As the meal drew to a close, Bard stood slowly, their masked face turning toward Mary. The skeletal figure swayed gently, her ribbons brushing the floor like whispers of silk. poet raised a hand, their voice ringing out in a tone that was both soft and commanding, as though it carried the weight of centuries behind it. "And now," they said, their words wrapping around the room like tendrils of smoke, "the judgment." Violet's breath caught, her eyes shone with wonder. She squeezed Ivy's hand beneath the table, her small fingers trembling with excitement. Mary tilted her skull-like head towards the girls, her hollow sockets seeming to fix on them, though Violet felt no fear, only pride. Iera stepped forward, her sharp gaze sweeping over the table, before settling on the sisters. "They have been good," she said, her voice low and steady, with a faint hint of something like satisfaction. "Their deeds are small, but their hearts are bright. Sweet Mary sees this, and she approves." The declaration hung in the air, heavy and final, like the closing of a great book. Violet's chest swelled, her heart beating so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. "She likes us," she whispered fiercely to Ivy, who nodded quickly but didn't look away from the table. Ivy's green eyes were wide and dark, her expression unreadable. Violet noticed the way her sister's hand trembled slightly in hers, but she thought it must be from excitement. Bard stepped closer to the table, their mask gleaming faintly in the firelight as they looked down at Hazel. "And you, good lady," they said, their voice softer now, almost intimate. "Strength and guidance are reflected in your young ones. Sweet Mary commends you." Violet turned to her mother, expecting to see the same joy she felt mirrored on her face, but her mother's expression was tight, her jaw set, and her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were pale. She inclined her head slightly, her voice even but low as she replied, "Thank you. They are good girls. I am proud of them." Violet beamed, her heart soaring at the praise, but her mother's tone felt strange, as though she were holding something back. She didn't understand why her mother wasn't smiling, why Ivy wouldn't meet her eyes, but she didn't dwell on it. She was too wrapped up in the magic of the moment, the thrill of being judged good by Mari Lwyd herself. Bard turned back to Mary, their movements fluid and strange. "The children are found worthy," they said, their voices lilting like a song. "Let this be known, and let this be remembered." Mary tilted her head again, her ribbons fluttering as though stirred by an unseen breeze. Violet thought she saw the faintest flickering of something in Mary's hollow sockets. Approval, perhaps, or a glimmer of warmth. She gripped Ivy's hand tighter, her face glowing with pride. "This is the best night ever," she whispered to her sister, her voice barely audible. Ivy nodded again, but her hand trembled harder, her green eyes darting between their mother and Mary. Violet didn't notice. She was too caught up in the magic, too wrapped in the shimmering ribbons and the ancient lilting voices that seemed to fill the room with something Violet would later think of only as wonder. After the poet's declaration, the room seemed to shift, a faint hush falling over it as the entourage moved in unison. Iera approached first, carrying her wicker basket with deliberate care. She knelt before the girls, her sharp eyes gleaming, as she reached inside. Inside the basket, Violet could see a fine powder that shone and sparkled with its own magic, like snow or a very pale ash. From the depths of the basket, beneath the powder, she pulled out two small bundles wrapped in aged cloth, tied with frayed ribbons the color of twilight. The cloth shimmered faintly in the firelight, as though it held something precious. She handed one bundle to each girl, her thin fingers brushing lightly against their hands. "For you, little ones," Viera said, her voice low and smooth, like the creak of an old oak in the wind. "Gifts for good hearts, to carry into the years ahead." Violet's breath caught as she untied the ribbon, her fingers fumbling in her excitement. Inside the bundle lay a small, intricately carved wooden charm, shaped like a horse, its features delicate and precise. It seemed impossibly perfect, the wood polished to a soft glow that felt warm in her palm. Ivy opened hers more hesitantly, revealing a matching charm, though hers was shaped like a bird, its wings outstretched as if frozen mid-flight. "They're beautiful," Violet whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "Thank you." Her eyes darted to the basket woman, who inclined her head slightly, her lips curling into that faint, unreadable smile. Drimmer approached next, his broad frame towering over the girls, as he crouched down to their level. In his hands he held two small drums, each no larger than a dinner plate. The skins were stretched tight, the rims painted with swirling patterns of blue and green that seemed to dance in the flickering firelight. He placed them gently in front of the girls, his voice low and rumbling as he spoke. "For rhythm," he said, his eyes fixed on Violet, "to guide your steps, to remind you that every good heart beats strong." Violet touched the drum reverently, running her fingers along the painted edge. It felt alive beneath her hands, as though it carried its own faint hum of music. She glanced at Ivy, who was holding hers carefully, her green eyes wide as she stared at the swirling patterns. "Thank you," Violet said again, her voice small but sincere. The drummer nodded once, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he rose. Finally, the poet approached, their thin figure casting a shadow that stretched impossibly long across the room. From the folds of their patchwork cloak, they withdrew two slender books, their covers bound in faded leather that looked older than the house itself. They placed one in each girl's hands, their voice lilting as they spoke. "For words," the poet said, their masked face tilting slightly, "to fill your minds and guide your tongues. Every good heart must know how to speak." Violet opened her book slowly, her hands trembling with reverence. The pages were filled with strange looping script she didn't recognize, accompanied by delicate illustrations of creatures she'd never seen. Twisting trees, rivers that seemed to flow across the page, and shadowy figures with glowing eyes. "It's like magic," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked up at the poet, her violet eyes shining. "Thank you so much." The poet tilted their head again, their mask catching the light in a way that made it seem to shift. "You will learn," they said simply, "and you will remember." Violet's heart swelled with pride and wonder as she clutched the gifts to her chest. She felt like the luckiest girl in the world, chosen and seen by sweet Mary and her companions. She didn't notice the way her mother's eyes flicked warily to each gift, nor the way Ivy's hands trembled as she held her bird charm. All Violet saw was magic, shimmering and real, and all she felt was joy. Violet clutched the carved horse in her hand, her heart brimming with the kind of joy that demanded to be shared. She turned to Mary, her violet eyes wide with excitement. "May I give you a gift too?" she asked, her voice trembling but earnest. For a moment the room seemed to still, the shadows frozen against the walls. Mary tilted her head, her ribbons swaying faintly. The masked poet stepped forward. "Each gift carries meaning," Bard said, their voice soft and melodic. "What would you offer, child of bright eyes?" Violet glanced at Ivy, who nodded nervously, then looked back at Mary and her court. "I'll tell you a story," she said, stepping into the open space near the fire. She set her charm gently on the table, brushed her hands against her nightgown, the faintest shiver of nerves dancing up her spine. "But not with words. With this." She raised her arms and began to move. Her bare feet glided across the floor, her small frame illuminated by the flickering firelight. Violet twirled and leapt, her movements guided not by training, but by the boundless belief in her own imagination. She became the storyteller, weaving a tale of magic, belief, and perseverance through each sweeping arc of her arms and each delicate step. Her dance told of a young girl lost in a forest of shadows, finding her way by following the faintest glimmers of starlight. Her feet tapped lightly as if crossing a bridge made of frost. Her arms reached upward as though grasping at constellations. The steady thrum of the drum joined her movements, the sound deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. The drummer watched her with a faint smile, his hands moving deliberately, shaping her dance into something larger, something alive. The poet stepped forward, their voice rising above the rhythm, weaving words around Violet's movements. In shadows deep where none could see, a heart of light sought to break free. Through the winds that howled, through trees that wept, a child of stars her promise kept. Her steps were small, her path unsure, yet stars above did guide her pure. And when she fell, she rose again, her joy the sword that darkness bends. The words curled around the air like smoke, and Violet moved with them, her young face glowing with effort and delight. She imagined herself as the girl in the poet's story, her tiny steps forging paths through impossible darkness, her leaps defying the gravity of despair. Her story ended with a triumphant spin, her arms outstretched as though she were casting light into every shadow. When she stopped, breathless and gleaming and beaming, fire flared briefly behind her, casting her small figure in a golden glow. The drummer stilled his hand, the last beat echoing softly in the room, and the poet lowered their head as though in reverence. "Your gift is received," Bard said, their voice softer now, almost solemn. "And it is bright." Violet glanced at her mother, expecting to see the same joy she felt. But her mother's face was tight, her eyes glassy as they flicked to the still snoring father slumped in his chair. Ivy's hands were fidgeting on her lap, her green eyes darting nervously between Mary and her sister. Violet noticed none of this. She only felt the thrill of having been seen, of having given something worthy to sweet Mary and her court. She stood tall, heart soaring, as though her small body could barely contain the light of the story she just told. Violet's heart swelled with pride as the poet's words echoed in her ears. Her gift is received, and it is bright. She felt as though her chest might burst at the warmth of Mary's approval. Mary's ribbons swayed gently, almost languidly, as if nodding to her in acknowledgment. Violet clasped her hands together, grinning at Ivy, who managed a shaky smile in return. "Girls," her mother said, her voice soft but firm, "it's time to clear the table." There was a note of finality in her tone, a subtle shift that Violet didn't fully understand. Obediently, she and Ivy slid from the bench, carefully gathering the empty bowls and plates. Violet balanced the wooden cups on top of a stack of dishes, moving toward the kitchen with her sister trailing close behind. As the girls busied themselves with their task, the mother turned back to Mary and her court, her face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, was unreadable, a mask of calm composure that didn't quite match the tension in her eyes. "I trust you've been satisfied," she said carefully, her voice low enough that Mary barely caught the words over the clink of the dishes. Mary's head tilted toward her, the ribbons brushing lightly against the air. Iera leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze piercing. "Satisfied with some," she murmured, her voices deliberate and cool, though they seemed to carry more weight than Violet could comprehend. Bard spoke next, their voice light but edged with something that curled uneasily in the air. "Not all shadows are easily banished," they said, stepping closer to the fire. "Some linger, heavy and unmoving. Such burdens weigh a house down." Violet, engrossed in rinsing a bowl, didn't notice the way her mother's lips pressed into a thin line, or how her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles whitened. "Shadows have their time," her mother replied, her voice even but strained. "But light finds its way through, given time and care." Bremer shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping softly on the edge of his drum, the rhythm slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat. "Some shadows," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "must be carried out, lest they choke the flame." At the far end of the room, the father stirred slightly in his chair, his glass tilting dangerously in his hand. He muttered something incoherent before settling back into his slouched position, his head lolling toward his chest. Violet glanced toward him briefly, but only to see if he might finally wake up and join the celebration. She dismissed him just as quickly, too focused on the task at hand and the residual thrill of Mary's praise. In the hearth's glow, the ribbons on Mary's skull twitched faintly, like the flicker of candlelight. Violet's mother straightened her back, her voice calm, but her eyes sharp as she met Mary's hollow gaze. "You've seen the good," Hazel said evenly. "You've seen what matters." Iera leaned back, her sharp lips curling into that faint, unsettling smile. "Yes," she murmured, her tone almost amused. "And yet, what does not matter still weighs heavy." Violet stacked the last of the cups, oblivious to the way the air seemed to grow heavier, the shadows deeper, and the firelight dimmer, as her mother remained locked in that quiet, tense conversation with the court. For Violet, the evening still felt like magic. Bright and full of wonder, she hummed softly to herself as she wiped her hands and prepared to return to the table. Court's attention shifted, and Bard turned their faced mask toward the kitchen, where Violet and Ivy had just finished their task. "Come, little ones," the poet called, their voice lilting and warm, though there was an undercurrent of something Violet couldn't quite name. "Join us again. We have a question for you." Violet's eyes lit up, and she quickly tugged Ivy's hand, pulling her sister toward the table, where the court sat like otherworldly figures in the flickering firelight. The ribbons on Mary's skull swayed gently, and Violet felt as though they were watching her, waiting for her answer. She clasped her hands in front of her, her violet eyes wide and earnest. Ivy hung back slightly, her green eyes darting nervously between the court and their mother, who now stood at the edge of the table, her lips pressed tightly together. The poet knelt slightly, their thin frame folding gracefully as they addressed Violet directly. "Tell us, bright child," they began, their voice soft and melodic. "What do you believe becomes of those who are not good? What punishments befit those whose hearts have strayed?" Violet's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the excitement of being asked such an important question. She straightened her posture, her voice clear and confident as she spoke. "The stories say that sweet Mary and her court decide," she began, her gaze flicking between the poet and Mary. "Those who are not good, they don't get blessings. Some are given warnings, and others—" She hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "Others are punished, so they can learn, so they don't hurt anyone else." "And do you think," the poet continued, tilting their head as they leaned closer, "that we are just in carrying out such punishments?" Violet nodded vigorously, her chest swelling with conviction. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "Mary sees what we can't. She knows what's in people's hearts. If someone is punished, it's because they deserve it, and it's for their own good. Mari Lwyd doesn't make mistakes." She glanced briefly at her mother, hoping for a smile of approval, but her mother's face remained still, her expression unreadable. Violet turned back to Bard, her small hands fluttering like her heart. "I believe in sweet Mary," she said earnestly. "She's fair and she's good. I know she is." Bard turned to face Ivy now, who kept her eyes glancing down at the table, occasionally flicking up to see the eyes of the court, and careful not to look into the empty sockets of Mary. "And you, child of hearth, what do you think of sweet Mary? Are her punishments just?" they asked Ivy, their eyes behind their mask, probing to meet Ivy's green eyes. When Ivy's eyes met the poet's eyes, she spoke for the first time in a while. "I trust that Mary's punishments are kinder on the wicked than the wicked are?" She said it like a question, and Mary turned her skeletal head to Ivy, and she nodded once before turning away to look towards the father. The ribbons shook as well, the bells rang in the night, and Drummer's drum beat along with the bell. Ivy opened her mouth like she was going to ask more, before she shut her mouth tight, looking down at the table with no more words to offer to the court. The poet straightened slowly, their mask gleaming faintly in the firelight as they turned toward Mary. "From the mouths of the faithful," they said softly, their voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Mary's head tilted slightly, her ribbons fluttering faintly, as if in response. Violet's chest swelled with pride, feeling as though she'd done something grand and important by speaking her heart. She didn't notice the way the air in the room seemed heavier now, or the way Ivy's hand trembled slightly at her side, nor did she catch the faint flicker of alarm that passed over her mother's face as she glanced toward the slumped figure of the father in his chair. To Violet, the evening still felt like a dream come true, filled with magic and meaning. She stood tall, basking in the attention of the court, oblivious to the shadows that stretched just a little longer, and the firelight that dimmed just a little more. The room seemed to hum with a strange energy. As Bard straightened fully, their masked face turning toward Mary. The skeletal figure swayed gently, her ribbons twisting as though caught in an unseen current. The poet's voice rose, soft but resonant, carrying an air of finality that made Violet's heart leap. "Sweet Mary has seen what lies within this house," they began, the words hurling through the air like smoke. "There is one among you whose heart is heavy with neglect and shadow. It is he who must face the consequences." Violet's breath hitched, her eyes darting toward her father slumped in his chair by the fire. The glass in his hand tipped further, spilling the last of its contents onto the floor. His face, slack and lined with weariness, twitched faintly, though his snores remained soft and steady. Violet felt her pulse quicken, her chest fluttering with a mixture of awe and exhilaration. A punishment! She'd heard the stories, but never in her wildest dreams had she thought she might witness one herself. It felt like an honor, a glimpse into something sacred and ancient. Iera stepped forward, her sharp eyes fixed on the father, as she spoke in a slow, deliberate tone. "He has allowed shadows to creep where light once shone. His hands grow idle while others toil. His spirit lies stagnant, pulling those around him into his depths." Her gaze flicked to the mother who stood rigid by the table, her face pale but composed, her lips pressed tightly together, and her hands gripped the back of a chair as though anchoring herself. Mary tilted her head, her hollow socket seeming to bore into the father as the ribbons twisted violently around her skull. Though the air in the room was still, Drimmer began to tap a slow, steady rhythm, the sound deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. Violet thought it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, like the heartbeat of the house itself, growing louder and stronger with each beat. The firelight dimmed further, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally across the walls. The poet stepped closer to the father, their mask gleaming faintly as they spoke. "To let the hearth grow cold is to fail those who depend on its warmth. To sleep while others labor is to invite the night to claim you." Their voice rose slightly, filled with an eerie lyrical cadence that sent a shiver down Ivy's spine. Ivy clung to Violet's arm, green eyes wide and fearful, but Violet barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on Mary and her court, their movements elegant and deliberate, their presence radiating a power that felt larger than life. Hazel's face was taut, her jaw clenched as though holding back words. Her eyes flicked from Mary to Bard to her husband, and Violet thought she saw a faint sheen of moisture in her mother's eyes, though her mother quickly blinked it away. Ivy, on the other hand, looked terrified, her lips quivering as she tried to pull Violet's attention. "Violet," Ivy whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "I don't—" "Hush, Ivy," Violet murmured, her voice breathless with excitement. "This is important." The ribbons on Mary's skull swirled more violently now, their colors almost blurring into streaks of light as the shadows deepened. Violet thought she saw shapes in the shadow, twisting, spiraling forms that seemed to writhe just beyond the edges of her vision. She felt no fear, only awe, as though she were watching the unfolding of a great story, one she would remember forever. Her father stirred slightly in his chair, his face slack and pale. A low groan escaped his lips, and his hand twitched faintly, but he didn't wake. Violet turned back to the court, her violet eyes wide with wonder. For her, the room wasn't dark and disturbing. It was alive, filled with magic and justice. She clutched Ivy's hand, her heart thrumming, as she waited to see what would happen next. The air in the room thickened, vibrating with an unspoken power, as the court began to move with slow, deliberate grace. Grimmer's rhythm deepened, each beat resonating through Violet's chest, like the steady pulse of the earth itself. Mary stepped forward, her ribbons swirling wildly now, the colors shimmering as though they were woven from threads of moonlight and shadow. Bard raised their hands, their voice lifting into a haunting chant, words that Violet didn't understand, but felt in her very bones. To Violet, the scene was short of nothing of ancient and magical. The fire, though dimmed, cast a golden glow across Mary's skeletal face, illuminating the intricate carvings etched into her polished bone. Her hollow sockets seemed to shine with an inner light, and the ribbons that spiraled around her created an ethereal aura, as if she were a goddess stepping out of a dream. The shadows on the walls no longer danced randomly. They moved with purpose, forming patterns that felt like the turning of a great cosmic wheel. Braun stirred again, a low groan escaping his lips as his head lolled to one side. The court surrounded him now, their movements synchronized, like the pieces of an elegant clockwork machine. Iera stepped forward, reaching into her wicker basket and pulling out and drawing out a handful of something that sparkled faintly in the firelight. Ash, perhaps, or fragments of frost. She scattered it over the father with a slow, deliberate motion, her sharp eyes unblinking. Bard's chant grew louder, weaving around the drum beats in a melody that seemed to echo from some otherworldly place. To Violet, it was a ritual of immense beauty. She clutched Ivy's hand tightly, her violet eyes wide and shining as she watched. The air seemed to hum with light and energy, but she felt her heart swell, not with fear, but with reverence. "It's so beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "They're making it right." Mary raised her head, her ribbons swirling upward like tendrils of smoke. and the drummer struck the drum with a final resonant beat. In that instant the fire flared, filling the room with brilliant light. Ron's body stiffened, his head tilting back, and for a brief moment his face seemed peaceful, serene even. Then the light dimmed again, and his form slumped forward, utterly still. To Violet it wasn't death, it was transcendence. The court moved back as one, their figures silhouetted against the soft glow of the hearth. Mari Lwyd tilted her head toward the mother, her ribbons drifting to rest in stillness, as though the act was complete. Violet felt her heart thrum with awe, her small frame trembling as she turned to Ivy. "Did you see?" she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "They made everything right. It was so perfect." Ivy said nothing, green eyes wide with horror, tears streaming down her pale face. Their mother's expression remained unreadable, her hands frozen and pale on the back of the chair. But to Violet none of this registered. All she could see was the beauty of the moment, the ribbons, the light, the magic, and all she could feel was gratitude for being allowed to witness something so sacred and extraordinary. As the firelight flickered and settled, Mari Lwyd moved forward, her skeletal head tilting downward as though inspecting the lifeless form of the father. The ribbons that had been swirling in chaotic splendor now drifted softly, like the final fall of autumn leaves. The court remained silent, their faces, masked or otherwise, calm and solemn. Bard knelt by the body, their thin hands brushing lightly against the father's chest, before standing and turning to Mari. "The weight is lifted," Poet intoned, their voice soft and melodic, almost reverent. "What was stagnant is no more. The hearth may now burn clean." Yera approached next, their sharp eye narrowing as she reached into her basket once more. From it she withdrew a length of cloth, dark and shimmering like the night sky. She draped it over the body with deliberate care, the fabric settling unnaturally, as though it moved on its own. Violet thought it looked like a ceremonial shroud, something sacred and ancient, and her heart swelled with awe at the sight. She barely noticed Ivy's trembling, or the way their mother's face had gone pale, her expression frozen in a mask of composure. Yera's voice cut through the silence, smooth and deliberate. "The burden is ours to carry now. It does not belong to this house any longer." He glanced at the mother, her sharp eyes softening ever so slightly. "You have endured, and you will endure. This, sweet Mari, ensures." Mari tilted her head toward the mother, her ribbons brushing lightly against the edges of the table. Hazel's lips parted slightly, her breath hatching as she forced herself to meet the hollow gaze of the skeletal figure. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "for what you've done. For—" she faltered, her hands gripping the back of the chair as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. "For seeing us." Mari did not speak. She never did. But her presence seemed to fill the room with an unspoken acknowledgment. Bard turned back to Violet and Ivy, their mask catching the firelight as they addressed the girls. "For what you have witnessed tonight is not for fear," they said, their voice gentle but firm. "It is for understanding. The hearth burns brighter now. The light is yours to carry forward." Violet's chest swelled with pride, her violet eyes shining as she nodded eagerly. "We'll be good," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We'll always be good. We'll keep the light strong." Ivy said nothing, her green eyes still wide and glossy with unshed tears. Her small frame pressed tightly against Violet's side. The mother looked at her daughters, her face softening for just a moment before turning back to the court. "And the body?" she asked, her voice steady despite the faint tremor in her hands. Kiera glanced at Mary, who tilted her head once, ribbons fluttering faintly. Bard stepped forward. "We will take him," they said simply. "His shadow belongs elsewhere now. Your hearth must be your own." Grimmer struck a soft beat, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the room, and the court moved as one. Mary led them, ribbons trailing behind like the tail of a comet, as they lifted the shrouded body with ease, as though it weighed nothing at all. Violet watched, her heart pounding with awe and reverence. For her, it was like watching the closing of a grand and magical story, one filled with justice and wonder. She clutched Ivy's hand tightly, whispering, "They're making everything better." As the court carried the father's body toward the door, the mother stepped aside, her face pale but resolute. "Let it be done," she said, her voice firm despite the slight quiver in her tone. Mary paused in the doorway, her ribbon catching the faint breeze from outside. For a brief moment the skeletal head turned back, and Violet felt as though those hollow sockets were looking directly at her. When the court stepped into the night, the firelight casting their silhouettes against the snow before, the door creaked shut behind them, leaving the house quieter and darker than it had been before. In the weeks that followed, the house felt different, lighter, as though a shadow had been lifted from its walls. The fire burned brighter and warmer, its glow filling the room in a way that Violet hadn't noticed was missing before. The air was no longer heavy with the scent of stale cider and unspoken tensions. Instead, it carried the faint aroma of baking bread and freshly cleaned linens. Hazel worked with renewed energy, her movements steady and purposeful as she hummed softly to herself, while mending clothes or stirring pots. There was a calmness to her now, a quiet strength that seemed to ripple through the house. Violet felt it too. She woke each morning with a sense of excitement, a bubbling joy that carried her through her chores and play. She kept the carved horse on her nightstand, its polished surface gleaming in the soft morning light. Sometimes she'd take it in her hands and turned it over and over, marveling at its perfection and remembering the night that Mari Lwyd had come. To Violet, it was the most magical night of her life, a moment that proved she and her family were good, seen, and worthy. Ivy was quieter than usual, but Violet didn't think much of it. "She's still shy," Violet would tell herself, when her sister's green eyes lingered on the carved bird she kept tucked in a drawer. "She'll understand someday." For Violet there was no question that they had been part of something extraordinary. As the winter days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, Violet began counting down the days until the next year's visit. Each time the snow fell, she would press her face to the window, watching it drift silently to the ground, and imagine the shimmering ribbons of Mary's skeletal crown weaving through the darkness. She would hum the melody she remembered from Bard's chant, making up her own verses as she danced lightly around the room, her feet barely skimming the wooden floor. By spring, the family had settled into a rhythm, one that felt more harmonious than Violet could ever recall. They ate together at the table, the fire crackling warmly behind them, and even Ivy began to smile more often. Their mother's hands were steady and sure, her voice firm but kind, as she reminded them to mind their chores and look after each other. "Mary will come again," she said one evening, her voice soft but certain as she glanced toward the glowing hearth, "and we'll be ready." Violet felt her heart soar at the thought. She imagined the shimmer of lanterns in the snow, the hauntingly beautiful voices of the court, and the graceful movements of Mary herself. She promised herself that she would dance again, tell another story, and show them just how good they had been. "She'll be so pleased," Violet whispered to Ivy one night, as they lay curled together beneath their blankets. "Don't you think?" Ivy turned her green eyes to her sister, her expression shadowed by something Violet couldn't name, but after a moment she nodded. "Yes," she said softly, "she'll be pleased." As Violet drifted off to sleep, with the carved horse clasped tightly in her hands, she dreamed of ribbons, lanterns, and the steady rhythm of a drum beat, carrying her into the promise of another magical winter night. For Violet, the light of Mari Lwyd's visit had only just begun to shine.